The metallic collar around Darren's neck was a constant reminder of his servitude. The cold weight against his skin, the subtle vibration of the energy coursing through its circuits, and the tightening that increased whenever he resisted. Everything was meticulously designed to break his will. But Darren was not a man who bent easily. He remained on his knees in a vast hall, his wrists shackled behind his back, while the eyes of dozens of aliens observed him as if he were an exotic commodity. The slave auction took place on an elevated platform, surrounded by bright holograms displaying details about each captured human. The bidders, consisting of nobles and commanders of the Zyrathian Empire, competed to acquire the rarest specimens. Humans were considered inferior, but a strong and resilient human servant still held value. Darren clenched his teeth as he heard the auctioneer's announcement. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have something special. A human specimen in perfect condition, strong, resilient, and with an indomitable personality. A challenge even for the most experienced, who will make the first bid." Soft laughter spread through the hall. To them, he was nothing more than a wild animal to be tamed. But among all the aliens present, only one figure stood out. Seated on an elevated throne, Commander Zyra observed Darren with a sharp and intrigued gaze. Zyra was a renowned warrior, belonging to a noble lineage of Zyrathians. Her metallic blue skin shimmered under the hall's lights, and her intense golden eyes conveyed both authority and mystery. Her body was sculpted by the advanced genetics of her race and the rigorous military training that had propelled her to the top of the hierarchy. She did not need a slave. She could have any servant of her own kind, but there was something about that human that intrigued her. She leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her fingers, in a relaxed yet dangerous posture. 10 million. "Credits," she declared without hesitation. Silence fell over the hall. The amount was exorbitant, but no one dared challenge the commander's bid. No one wanted to pick a fight with one of the most feared women in the Empire. The auctioneer smiled satisfied. "Sold to Commander Zyra." Darren remained motionless, his expression impassive. But inside, his mind was racing. Who was this alien? Why would she pay so much for him? He knew that, whatever the reason, nothing good would come of it. Hours later, he was taken to Zyra's ship. His new home was a massive war cruiser, a machine of destruction that traversed the galaxy in the name of the Zyrathian Empire. The interior of the ship was luxurious yet cold and intimidating, reflecting the status of his new owner. He was led by guards to her quarters. The commander's headquarters was spacious, with glass walls that offered a stunning view of space. In the center of the room, a grand metallic throne stood, and before it, Zyra waited. Darren was shoved to the floor, on his knees before her. He did not show weakness, keeping his gaze fixed on the alien without bowing. Zyra stood up and slowly walked toward him. Her steps were precise, her posture imposing. She circled around him, assessing him as if analyzing a newly acquired piece of technology. "You are an interesting specimen, human," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with authority. "I am not like the other nobles who buy slaves for cheap entertainment. I chose you because I wanted something different." Darren did not respond. He knew that any wrong word could cost him dearly, but his silence seemed to amuse her. Zyra raised an eyebrow and stopped in front of him. "You are not afraid of me, are you?" Darren finally spoke, his voice firm. "I fear no one." Zyra smiled, a glint of challenge in her golden eyes. "Interesting. Then let's see how far your courage goes, human. You belong to me now, and I decide your fate." Darren held his gaze firm. He might be captive, he might be in the hands of a powerful alien, but one thing was certain. He would not be tamed so easily. And deep down, Zira knew it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was exactly what drew her to him. Zira couldn't take her eyes off him. Since purchasing Darren at the auction, she had expected to see submission, despair, maybe even hatred in his eyes. But all she saw was defiance. He did not bow, did not avert his gaze, did not show fear. This intrigued her in a way she had never felt before. She was used to being feared. As the commander of one of the largest fleets in the Zarathian Empire, she was respected and revered for her strength, her coldness, her ability to crush any resistance. But this human, this mere human, dared to challenge her without uttering a single word. Gira sat on her throne, observing Darren through the translucent glass of her private chamber. He was in the space assigned to him, a luxurious room by a slave's standards. There were no chains, no cage, only the electronic collar around his neck, a reminder that if he tried to escape, he would be incapacitated instantly. But he didn't try. He spent his days training. Zira had given him access to an exercise area, curious to see how he would react. And what she saw was fascinating. Darren woke up early, before even the Zarathian servants were active. His body was disciplined, his mind focused. He trained, alone, as if preparing for a war that would never come. His muscles flexed with each strike against the combat simulator, his sweat-soaked skin glistening under the artificial light. Zira shouldn't care. He was just a human, a slave. But every time she watched him, something inside her stirred. Her gaze traveled over every detail of his body, his broad shoulders, his strong arms, his determined expression. He was different from the Zarathians, whose genetics had been artificially enhanced for peak performance. Darren was pure instinct, pure effort, a survival machine sculpted by adversity itself. And she found that exciting. Zira abruptly stood up from her throne. This was ridiculous. She was a commander of the Empire, a warrior of noble lineage. She shouldn't feel this kind of attraction to a human. But no matter how much she tried to push these thoughts away, they kept returning stronger each time. She decided to test his resilience. Darren was finishing another training session when the door to the facility opened. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The atmosphere grew tenser, heavier. Gira entered with her usual impeccable posture, her metallic blue armor molding perfectly to her slender and strong body. Her golden eyes gleamed, analyzing him with that piercing look he had come to recognize. "You're working hard, human." Her voice was firm, but there was something else, an unusual softness. Darren turned, his chest rising and falling slowly after the workout. His clothes were drenched in sweat, his body pulsing with the energy of exercise. He knew Zira was examining every detail. "I have to maintain my strength," he replied, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "You never know when I might need it." Zira arched an eyebrow. "Do you still believe you can escape?" Darren smirked slightly. "I'm not naive, but I'm also not a domesticated dog." Darren's quick and firm response stirred something inside her, something that made her want to test him even more. She approached, her steps slow and controlled, until the distance between them was minimal. Darren did not back away. She noticed his scent, not like the synthetic perfumes used by Zarathian nobles, but something natural, warm, masculine. His skin seemed to radiate heat, and that made something in her body react in an unexpected way. "You're lucky to be under my ownership, human," she said, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "If you were in someone else's hands, you would have been broken by now." Darren tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze locked on hers. "And what if I'd rather be broken than kneel?" Zira felt a shiver run through her skin. There was something about him that was dangerously addictive. She raised her hand and let her fingers glide along the side of Darren's face, as if evaluating his texture, his resistance. He remained still, but his eyes carried a spark of provocation. She should punish him for his insolence. She should remind him of his place. But instead, the tip of her fingers traced his jawline before pulling away. "We'll see how long your resistance lasts," she murmured, before turning and leaving the room, leaving behind only the lingering tension in the air. What the hell was happening to her, and why didn't she want it to stop? Darren didn't know what to think when he received the order to appear at Zira's dinner table. It was unusual. Slaves did not dine with their owners, especially not with a high-ranking commander. But there he was, standing before the immense, dark glass table, waiting for her arrival. The hall was luxurious, like everything on that ship. The ceilings were high, adorned with luminous panels that simulated the sky of a distant galaxy. The furniture had an elegant and imposing design, reflecting the power of its owner. The table was set for two, which only made everything feel even stranger. The guards who had escorted him there said nothing, merely leaving him and stepping aside. Darren could feel the eyes of the crew on him, even if he couldn't see them. Everyone must have been wondering the same thing. Why had a human slave been invited to a private dinner with the commander? The sound of the door sliding open interrupted his thoughts. Zira entered. This time she was not wearing her battle armor. Instead, she wore a dark dress, made of a translucent fabric that flowed around her as if it had a life of its own. Her metallic blue skin contrasted perfectly with the deep tones of the garment, and her golden eyes shimmered under the artificial light of the hall. Darren couldn't help but notice how stunning she was. She approached with her usual commanding posture, but there was something different in her gaze, a kind of restrained curiosity. "Sit down," she ordered, settling into her high-backed chair. Darren hesitated for a second. This still felt like a game he didn't fully understand. But without showing weakness, he pulled out the chair in front of him and sat down. The food was already served, exotic dishes with textures and colors he had never seen before. There were crystal-clear blue drinks in elegant glasses, emanating a faint glow. "Surprised?" Zira asked, watching him. "I don't know what to expect from you," he replied, keeping his composure. Zira gave a small smile as if she liked his answer. "A normal slave would already be trembling before me. You, however, continue to look at me as if we were equals." Darren picked up one of the glasses and swirled the liquid between his fingers. "Maybe because I see no reason to fear you." Zira tilted her head slightly, evaluating him. Then she picked up her own glass and took a sip. "You're lucky, human. Most commanders would have made you kneel before even allowing you to breathe the same air as them." Darren raised the glass to his lips and tasted the drink. The flavor was strong, sweet, with a slight burn as it went down his throat. "And why are you different?" Zira set her glass down and rested her elbows on the table, intertwining her fingers. "Because you amuse me." Darren arched an eyebrow. "So I'm your entertainment?" She smiled but didn't answer. The dinner continued. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried something unspoken. From time to time, their eyes met, and Darren felt that there was something more there. Zira didn't treat him like a mere slave. There was curiosity, desire. She was testing his limits, but at the same time, he sensed that she was also testing her own. When the meal ended, Zira leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, analyzing him once again. "Darren," she called, and for the first time, she said his name without mockery or arrogance. He lifted his eyes to her. "I should hate you," she said, her voice lower, more introspective. "Humans are inferior, weak. My people use them as tools, as playthings. But you don't behave like a tool. You don't act like a plaything." Darren kept his gaze fixed on hers. Maybe because I'm not. Zira gave a small smile and stood up. He instinctively did the same, sensing that this conversation was far from over. She walked up to him and stopped very close. Close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin, the faint metallic scent she emitted. "Be careful, human," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. "You're starting to become a problem for me." Before he could respond, she turned and left the hall, leaving him there, confused and intrigued. Darren didn't know exactly what was happening, but he was sure of one thing. Zira was fighting something inside herself, and somehow he was part of that battle. Zira could no longer ignore it. For weeks she had tried to resist, tried to convince herself that it was just curiosity, a fleeting whim. But every time she saw Darren, every time she felt his presence, her resolve weakened. He was not like the other slaves. He didn't bow, he didn't beg, and, worse yet, he made her question her own beliefs. Now, alone in her quarters, Zira found herself staring at her own reflection in the large, opaque glass mirror that adorned her room. Her heart pounded with an unfamiliar restlessness. Her body longed for something she had never felt before. She needed to see him, more than that. She needed to have him. Without hesitating any longer, she activated her communicator and gave the order without pretense. "Bring Darren to my quarters. Now." Darren didn't show surprise when the guards arrived. Ever since the dinner with Zira, he had felt that something was different. She looked at him differently, spoke to him differently, and now here he was, escorted to the commander's private chambers. The door slid open, revealing a luxurious room, adorned with dark tones and metallic details. The atmosphere was warmer than the rest of the ship, and the scent was intoxicating, a subtle mix of exotic oils and something purely Zirathian. At the center of the room, Zira waited. This time, she was not wearing her armor or any formal attire, just a light, form-fitting outfit that accentuated the sculpted curves of her athletic body. Her metallic blue skin glowed softly under the dim lighting, and her golden eyes were locked onto him with an intensity unlike any other time. The guards withdrew, leaving them alone. Darren crossed his arms, maintaining his steady gaze. "Commander," he said, his voice firm. Zira approached him slowly, each step calculated. But unlike her previous approaches, this time there was no cold provocation, no tone of superiority. There was only desire. She stopped in front of him, studying him as if trying to decipher her own inner conflict. "You challenge me, human," she murmured. Darren arched an eyebrow. "You seem to enjoy it." Zira narrowed her eyes slightly, but there was a hint of amusement in them. "I shouldn't," Darren smirked, "but you can't help it." Zira let out a soft sigh and finally reached out, placing her hand on his chest, feeling the rigid muscles beneath her fingers. The warmth of his human skin contrasted with her own cool temperature. It was different, strange, but addictive. Darren didn't move away. He didn't say anything. He simply allowed her to make her choice. Zira's hand traveled up to the side of his face, her fingers gliding along his strong jawline. "Darren," she whispered, her voice laced with something even she couldn't define. Then, without further hesitation, she did what she had been trying to resist for weeks. She pulled him close and claimed his lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was intense, charged with weeks of repressed tension. Zira was not the type to ask. She took. And Darren, instead of resisting, responded with equal intensity, his hands sliding around her waist. What had once been a game of domination and defiance was now transforming into something new, something uncontrollable. Zira didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in her life she was willing to find out. Darren woke to the artificial light in the room softly flickering, simulating the sunrise of a distant planet. His mind was still lost in the echoes of the night before, and every muscle in his body carried the memory of what had happened between him and Zira. He sat on the edge of the large metallic bed and ran a hand over his face. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had never thought that the cold and ruthless commander would eventually give in to the desire she had tried so hard to deny. And more than that, he had never imagined that he himself would respond in the way he had. He turned slightly and observed Zira sleeping beside him. She looked different. For the first time, she wasn't carrying that air of superiority and command. She was vulnerable, calm, her breathing light and serene. Her slender athletic body was partially covered by the sheets, and her metallic blue skin glowed softly under the dim lighting of the cabin. Darren should leave before she woke up. It was survival instinct speaking. He could not forget that technically he was still a slave on this ship, regardless of what had happened between them. But something stopped him from standing up immediately. He remained there, watching her, feeling a strange tightness in his chest that was not just physical desire but something deeper. Before he could decide, Zira opened her eyes. Her golden gaze met his, and unlike every time before, there was no coldness there, no arrogance. There was warmth. She propped herself up on her elbow and studied him for a moment before giving a small, knowing smile. "Were you planning to leave without saying goodbye?" Her voice was husky, still tinged with sleep. Darren smirked. "I thought an imperial commander didn't need goodbyes." Zira let out a soft chuckle but didn't look away. "Maybe the commander doesn't, but Zira does." Darren's eyebrows furrowed slightly. This was different. She wasn't playing. She wasn't testing him. She was serious. Zira sat up and instinctively pulled the sheet around her, though there was no real need. Her gaze was more intense than ever, but not in the predatory way it had been before. It was something deeper. "I don't want you to be my slave anymore, Darren," she said, getting straight to the point with no hesitation. He blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Zira took a deep breath as if finally accepting something she had been trying to avoid for a long time. "I bought you because I wanted to tame you. I wanted a challenge, but..." She hesitated for a brief moment, just enough to reveal vulnerability, but quickly regained her confidence. "I realized I don't want you to be mine. Not like this." Darren remained silent. Zira continued, "I want you to stay by my side, not as a servant, but as my equal." She extended her hand, and Darren looked at it for a long moment. "As my husband." The words lingered in the air between them. Darren had never expected this. He had never imagined that one of the most powerful figures in the Zyrathian Empire would want something like this. But when he looked at Zira, he saw that she was completely sincere. She truly wanted him, not as a trophy, not as a plaything, but as her partner. And at that moment, Darren knew that his destiny had changed forever. Darren walked slowly through the metallic corridors of the ship, escorted by 2 Zyrathian guards. But this time there was no tension, no chains. His slave collar had been deactivated. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he had a guess. Since that morning, Zira had been different. Something inside her had changed, and deep down, he knew he was the reason for it. The doors to the Grand Command Hall slid open automatically, revealing Zira's imposing figure seated on her throne. But unlike every other time he had seen her there, this time she did not wear her commander's posture. She was relaxed, and her golden eyes no longer looked at him as a master looks at a slave, but as a woman looks at the man she desires by her side. The guard stepped back, leaving them alone. Darren stopped a few steps in front of her and crossed his arms. "You called for me?" Zira smiled slightly. "I called you to set you free." Darren remained silent, but his eyes examined every detail of her, trying to understand her true intentions. Zira stood and walked toward him. She extended her hand, and in her palm, she held a small black metallic device. This is the final command for your collar. If I press this button, it will deactivate forever. You will be free. Darren looked at the object for a moment. Why now? Zira sighed. Because I can no longer pretend that you are just a slave. Since the moment I bought you, I tried to mold you to fit within my rules, within the Empire's logic. But you never bowed. You never became what I wanted. She took a step closer, meeting his gaze directly. And now I realize that's exactly why I fell in love with you. Darren felt a different kind of warmth spread through his chest. Zira pressed the button on the device. The collar around Darren's neck emitted a soft mechanical sound and unlocked, falling to the floor with a light clank. He looked at the metallic object at his feet, then lifted his eyes to her. So that's it, he said, a subtle smile forming on his lips. I'm a free man now, Zira nodded. Yes, you can go anywhere you want. No Zyrathian will ever hunt you. Darren held her gaze for a long moment, then took a step forward. What if I want to stay? Zira blinked, surprised. Stay? Darren lifted his hand and gently touched her face. I want to stay with you, Zyra, not as a slave, not as property, but as your equal, as your companion. Her golden eyes widened slightly. You truly want this? Darren smiled. I've never wanted anything else. For a second, Zira seemed to process the reality of what was happening. Then slowly, a smile spread across her lips. She took his hand and pressed it against her chest. If that's what you desire, then I want more than just you by my side. She took a deep breath before saying the words that would change everything. I want us to have a family, Darren. His heart skipped a beat. Zira continued, her voice softer, but filled with conviction. I want us to have children, a mix of our two lineages. Warriors, free and strong, like you. I want us to be together, beyond wars, beyond the differences between our peoples. I want us to build something greater. Darren smiled. He didn't need anything else. He cupped Zyra's face in his hands and kissed her with everything he felt. The commander of the Zyrathian Empire was no longer his owner. Now, she was his woman. And the future that awaited them would be built together.